tested over 4,500,000 people for COVID-19 to date. Over the past week, an average of 43,000 people were tested daily, with 1% testing positive. Based on the most recent 7 days, there have been an average of 443 cases reported daily from across the country. Vaccination is one of the top public health achievements of all time, providing safe and effective prevention of serious illness, disability, and death due to infectious diseases, saving an estimated 2 to 3 million lives worldwide every year. Up until now, the world has never before worked as quickly and with such global solidarity on the technology and science required to rapidly produce a vaccine that will save lives and reduce the overall health and societal impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Getting this done in record time is no easy feat, as we must ensure any vaccine demonstrates the highest standard of safety and effectiveness. There are many steps and partners across research, government, and industry required to produce and deliver a safe and effective vaccine. All steps and partners are crucial. Nothing gets cut. Instead, fast-tracking means all hands on deck to increase collaboration, tighten partnerships, and to prepare, plan, and run as many steps in parallel as is feasible and appropriate. From developing and testing for safety and effectiveness, and manufacturing at scale to acquire, distributing, and finally administering and monitoring vaccine programs, many partners have been working tirelessly. But when the time comes, the ultimate success of a COVID-19 vaccine in Canada will depend on Canadians across the country rolling up their sleeves to receive the vaccine. Beyond protecting us as individuals, vaccination triumphs when we can build up immunity at the population level to create community immunity. This is what we'll need to bring to the spread of COVID-19 under widespread and lasting control. Currently, several COVID-19 candidate vaccines have initiated phase 3 clinical trials. This phase was preceded by phase 1 and 2 trials that demonstrated the safety of the candidate vaccines as well as their ability to stimulate an immune response in a small number of people. The current phase 3 trials involve tens of thousands of people to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of these COVID-19 vaccine candidates for preventing infection or the disease. Even after a vaccine is approved for use, as always, there will be ongoing data collection to monitor safety and effectiveness in the population. Regardless of which vaccine or vaccines successfully obtains regulatory approval, scaling up production, distributing the vaccine worldwide, and dispensing it to Canadians will be a very big task, and it is one we continue to actively plan for. I am cautiously optimistic. A successful vaccine can't come soon enough for me. Thank you.
Bonjour.
La semaine dernière, Dr. Tam et moi, nous avons répondu à une question sur les perspectives quant à un vaccin contre le COVID-19. Sans surprise, il y a eu beaucoup d'intérêt depuis, alors nous aimerions en dire un peu plus à ce sujet aujourd'hui. Je commencerai par la mise à jour habituelle des chiffres. Il y a eu 120 132 cas de COVID-19 au Canada, y compris 8 987 décès. 88% des personnes se sont rétablies. À ce jour, les laboratoires de tout le Canada ont fait passer un test de dépistage de la COVID-19 à plus de 4 500 000 personnes. Au cours de la dernière semaine, nous avons testé en moyenne 43 000 personnes chaque jour, dont 1% ont reçu un résultat positif. Sur les 7 derniers jours, il y a eu une moyenne de 443 cas signalés quotidiennement dans tout le pays. La vaccination est l'une des principales réalisations en matière de santé publique de tous les temps. Elle permet une prévention sûre et efficace des maladies graves, des incapacités et des décès dus aux maladies infectieuses et sauve environ 2 à 3 millions de vies dans le monde chaque année. Mais jusqu'à maintenant, le monde n'avait jamais travaillé aussi rapidement et avec une telle solidarité mondiale sur les aspects technologiques et scientifiques nécessaires pour produire rapidement un vaccin qui sauvera des vies et réduira les impacts globaux sur la santé et la société de la pandémie de COVID-19. D'y arriver à un temps record n'est pas une mince affaire, car nous devons nous assurer que tout vaccin démontre le plus haut niveau de sécurité et d'efficacité. L'intervention de nombreuses étapes et partenaires dans la recherche, le gouvernement et l'industrie est nécessaire pour produire et fournir un vaccin sûr et efficace. Toutes les étapes et tous les partenaires sont cruciaux. Rien n'est laissé au hasard. Au contraire, le travail en accéléré signifie que tous les intervenants participent en vue d'accroître la collaboration, de resserrer les partenariats et de préparer, planifier et exécuter autant d'étapes en parallèle qu'il est possible et approprié de le faire. De la mise au point et des essais d'innocuité et d'efficacité et de la fabrication à grande échelle à l'acquisition, la distribution et enfin la gestion et le suivi des programmes de vaccination, de nombreux partenaires auront travaillé sans relâche. Mais le moment venu, le succès ultime d'un vaccin contre la COVID-19 au Canada dépendra des Canadiens de partout au pays qui retrousseront leurs manches afin de recevoir le vaccin. En plus de nous protéger individuellement, la vaccination triomphe lorsque nous pouvons renforcer l'immunité à l'échelle de la population afin de créer une immunité collective. Et c'est ce dont nous aurons besoin pour assurer un contrôle généralisé et durable de la propagation de la COVID-19. Actuellement, plusieurs vaccins potentiels contre la COVID-19 sont passés à des essais cliniques de phase 3. Cette phase a été précédée par des essais de phase 1 et 2 qui ont démontré l'innocuité de ceux-ci ainsi que leur capacité à stimuler une réponse immunitaire chez un petit nombre de personnes. Les essais actuels de phase 3 impliquent des dizaines de milliers de personnes afin d'évaluer l'innocuité et l'efficacité de ces vaccins potentiels contre la COVID-19 pour prévenir l'infection ou la maladie. Et même après l'approbation d'un vaccin, comme toujours, il y aura une collecte de données en continu pour surveiller la sécurité et l'efficacité dans la population. Quel que soit le ou les vaccins qui obtiendront l'approbation réglementaire, l'augmentation de la production, la distribution du vaccin dans le monde entier et l'administration de celui-ci aux Canadiens sera une tâche colossale. Et nous continuons à en faire activement la planification. Nous affichons à cet égard un optimisme prudent en ce qui concerne la découverte d'un vaccin efficace. Nous croyons que le plus tôt sera le mieux. Merci.
Thank you, doctors. We will now open the line to questions. Vous pouvez poser vos questions dans l'une des deux langues officielles. We ask that you limit yourself to one question and one follow-up only. For those asking a question in the room, we ask that you make your way over to the freestanding mic. We'll start on the phone. Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Merci. Our first question, notre première question nous vient de Mia Rabson with the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Good afternoon. Dr. Tam, this is for a question for you. I think you mentioned the vaccine and how important it is to make sure that it's safe. Obviously, reports out of Russia today saying that they've approved the first vaccine. Do you have any concerns about that approval specifically and its impact on people's confidence in any vaccine that might be produced in Canada or for Canadians' use?
Well, I can't comment on the approval process for the Russian vaccine. Certainly in Canada, Health Canada is a regulatory authority and has solid processes, regimes in place so that before Health Canada approves a vaccine in any way, They will look at all the data that is produced through these phase 1 to 3 trials. And the system is, has been in place for a long time, and we have, of course, as people have seen, safe and effective vaccines in use in Canada. So I think that I have confidence and trust in the Canadian regulatory system. And the reason why I'm cautiously optimistic isn't because I don't think this is a great thing that there's all these inventions all over the world. This is very exciting. But that in this whole process, the key is that we ensure safety and the data on effectiveness or efficacy and quality assurance, which is what the regulator does, is as the most important aspect of the process. The other thing is that I do know that our regulatory scientists and authorities are linked in with international regulatory authorities to share data as rapidly as possible, so that if there were any signals of concern, we expect that to be shared internationally as well.
Thank you, Doctor. Follow-up?
Yeah, last week you released your recommendations or your guidance for returning to schools and talked about the evidence being relatively small for kids getting very sick or spreading the disease very widely. And now we're seeing reports out of the U.S. that 97,000 American kids have been diagnosed with COVID-19 in the last 2 weeks. And I'm just wondering if those statistics give you any pause on that evidence that you cited last week.
Well, I think, as I said, we will learn more and more about this virus as time goes by. We have had, of course, reports of cases in persons under the age of 20, so the 19 and under. I think we and that's posted. Just trying to look for. I think it's like over 900 cases to date. But obviously a lot of the schools have been closed, so we need to sort of watch that carefully. But to date, that has not been the epidemiologic picture. But I think, as I've said last week, younger children in particular, from the international studies so far, is not as efficient at transmitting the virus than older kids and adults. And the disease severity appears to be lower in children. So I think, as with reopening any social and economic space, we expect local jurisdictions and education and public health departments to work together with parents, teachers, to do it in a cautious way and monitor what happens. The key is that we diagnose cases rapidly, investigate the dynamics of what's going on, contact tracing fast, and being able to address any sort of clusters as fast as possible without necessarily, impacting, to be as localized as possible with those measures instead of, widespread school closures or impact is the goal. But we do have to watch what evolves in the Canadian context. In the U.S. context, of course, some of these communities have higher levels of virus transmission. And I think that is one of the key factors, is to understand your local virus transmission patterns and epidemiology as schools reopen.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question. Notre prochaine question is from Michel Lamarche avec TVA. Please go ahead.
Michel Lamarche with TVA.
Bonjour, j'aimerais vous entendre au sujet, de la Russie. Est-ce qu'à votre avis, le processus d'approbation de ce vaccin annoncé ce matin, ça vous semble rapide?
Seems a bit fast to you?
Merci pour la question. C'est Dr. New. C'est difficile pour nous autres, pour moi, pour commenter qu'est-ce qui se passe actuellement en Russie. Moi, on sait qu'à l'échelle mondiale, on a vraiment une bonne collaboration entre les scientifiques aussi, les personnes dans le domaine réglementaire pour la recherche qui continue pour un vaccin. Ici au Canada, on a vraiment un système très fiable pour vraiment donner un bon niveau de confiance aux Canadiens que pour n'importe quel vaccin qui va être approuvé au Canada, c'est vraiment efficace et aussi avec beaucoup de données pour assurer la sécurité. C'est difficile pour moi pour commenter qu'est-ce qui se passe en Russie, mais ça peut se prononcer très vite selon ce qu'on sait pour, comme on dit, la recherche en général. Les essais, combien de temps ça dure aussi, le plus grand nombre de personnes nécessaires pour, comme on a dit, pour un essai de phase 3. Que c'est très important, je pense, même pour les experts à l'extérieur de la Russie pour vraiment peut-être analyser les données pour peut-être avoir une meilleure idée de ce qui se passait en Russie. Donc, c'est ça, mais pour nous autres, je pense que le plus important chose, c'est qu'est-ce qu'on fait aussi au Canada avec notre système d'approbation réglementaire. Merci.
Merci, Dr. Michel. Question suivie?
Bien sûr. Donc, j'entendais Dr. Tam répondre en anglais un peu plus tôt en disant le Canada a un processus très bien établi avant d'approuver un vaccin. Avec le peu d'informations qu'on a de ce vaccin russe, voyez-vous comment le Canada pourrait approuver un vaccin comme celui-là où il manque beaucoup trop d'informations pour le faire?
Ce que je vois, je comprends maintenant, il manque beaucoup trop d'informations. Je pense que je peux vous dire aussi que à l'échelle technique, scientifique, il y a vraiment une bonne collaboration à travers le monde. Des fois, ce que je vois, c'est une annonce, c'est un peu comme on dit politique. Ça, c'est notre affaire. Pour nous autres, nous continuons à travailler avec nos homologues à travers le monde et je laisse l'autre côté, c'est vraiment quelque chose peut-être dans un autre monde aux autres officiels de côté politique.
Merci. Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question is from Sharon Kirky with the National Post. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Dr. Tam, Anne Longfield, the Children's Commissioner for England, said in an interview yesterday that testing of staff and students should be sort of part and parcel of school reopenings, and that tests should be carried out regularly, perhaps weekly. We know that, school-based testing for the virus has been done in places like Germany, but here the provincial plans for school reopenings are pretty much silent on the issue of random or regular testing of kids and teachers. We're asking parents to screen children before sending them to school and teachers to self-screen. But, given that so many people are asymptomatic, would you say that's sufficient? I mean, what are your thoughts on school-based testing? Wouldn't it give us some kind of early warning system?
Yeah, I think it's an concept that people have proposed and will continuously evaluate these kind of approaches. But given the technology available to us right now, and we continuously pursue new diagnostic capabilities as well. But right now, I think trying to test people on a regular basis, and children in particular, and teachers, it is not part of the approach. The key is obviously stay home, you're sick, and any time that you contact someone or if there's been an outbreak, of course, asymptomatic persons will be advised by local public health in terms of testing in that context. So if you actually had a case in your school, we expect rapid response and in terms of testing and looking at contacts. But, I think right now the technology in Canada doesn't support that kind of approach. And if you're asymptomatic, the tests right now, really have, we're assessing some of those approaches, but we have not found anything that is of sufficient performance to do that. And it's also a pretty big deal to try and to operationalize this at a local level as well. But we'll continue to examine what's in the realm of the possible and, the incorporation of testing into different aspects of reopening society for sure.
It's Dr. New. Maybe I just can add on to what Dr. Tam has said in terms of you were talking about sort of school kids and what's happening in the U.S. I think in many ways what's happening or what will happen in our schools here in Canada is also a reflection, as Dr. Tam has said, of what's happening in the local community. So I think it's very important to have a good understanding of how much the virus is circulating in any given community, because that would also dictate to what extent you might anticipate getting cases in the schools. For example, you were mentioning the U.S. I would say that certainly in certain communities in the U.S. where I think the lab positivity rate is quite high, probably over 5%, and so on, that if you have schools opening, then you might anticipate getting more kids testing positive. I can't really speak for England, United Kingdom, but I think here in Canada overall, our lab positivity rate is well below 5%, and therefore we wouldn't anticipate getting as many cases you might have with school reopenings in other parts of the world. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And certainly as we move forward, we're certainly open to looking at best practices, what's happening in other countries, and certainly at a local level, we'll leave it to the public health experts in the provinces, territories to adapt and see what works best in their context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharon. Follow-up question?
Yeah, as part of that, I mean, you talk about you're exploring new technologies, and I know that some epidemiologists and others are saying we need those fast, cheaper tests like paper strip antigen tests that, test saliva as well as nasal specimens. They may not be as good as PCR tests, but they could be a benefit to situations like school reopenings. And in some states like Arkansas, they've begun purchasing antigen testing kits and machines, and they're prioritizing them for K-12 schools, right? So is Canada working on evaluating and approving antigen testing?
Yeah, I'm aware of a number of technologies coming up that is currently actively being evaluated, including some of the technologies that you have mentioned, both from some of the laboratory public health labs, including the National Microbiology Lab, are helping to evaluate some of these newer approaches right now in reference to the tests that we have now, which is mainly PCR-based, lab-based testing. So absolutely, we're actively pursuing looking at that. And there has been a innovative process put out as trying to find the next technology available for Canada as well. So there's been some innovation funding provided to do that, and includes antigen testing. There are some of these newer approaches being submitted to the regulatory authority, Health Canada, right now. So they're also part of this effort to find us more sort of feasible, easy to use tests. We're also examining, and some of this is already going on things like wastewater monitoring, so that can potentially provide yet another approach to seeing if the virus is, as a signal for the virus appearing in certain communities as well. So yes, and just like the vaccine effort, the testing effort is going on all fronts to try and find us the appropriate next technologies.
Thank you, Doctor. We will now turn over to the room. CTV.
Hi, doctors. Mackenzie Gray with CTV News. Dr. Tam, I want to follow up on something you said in one of your previous questions about asymptomatic testing. You said that there isn't sufficient performance for people who are asymptomatic to get tested. Is that you kind of saying that if you're asymptomatic and you get tested that you can't trust the results or the results aren't good enough? Is there kind of a number or an idea you have about making sure that there's a specific kind of assurance that someone who gets tested and is asymptomatic can know whether or not they can trust the results?
So obviously, how the testing can help depends on the context. So if you're a close contact of someone, or if you are part of an outbreak investigation, public health authority will look at testing asymptomatic people in that context. It increases what we call your pre-test probability of actually being a case. So if you just test the asymptomatic people out of the blue in completely an environment where there isn't a virus, then the potential for a false positive might occur. Now, we're not actually that worried about false positives. We can probably manage those under these conditions. But what is more important is that if you're testing someone with PCR technologies to look for the virus today, it doesn't guarantee that a negative test today means that you may not be positive tomorrow. So that is one of the issues is, if there's a strong likelihood that you could be a case, keep monitoring the symptoms, because you may have to be tested again. At the beginning of an illness, in the first couple of days, there's very high false negative rates, between around sort of 4 days to 8 days, that kind of time span. You're going to pick up the majority of cases. The actual sensitivity of the test is going to be quite high. After that, it might fall off again. So the timing of where you're in the clinical course will essentially inform some of the testing performance. So I think that's part of it. But some of the newer ideas are like, if you have less sensitivity, but it still has to be a reasonable sensitivity, but you keep testing the same population again and again on a repeated serial basis, then the reduction in sensitivity may not be as much of a concern if you're able to keep testing people on a serial basis. And so some of those ideas are being actively explored in terms of, well, what does it bring in terms of an added strategy for Canada?
It's Dr. Maybe I'll just add a little bit onto what Dr. Tam had said. I think for the average Canadian, I think it's also important, if you do go for testing and you're asymptomatic and you go in with a certain idea, you actually understand what the test is able to tell you and what it doesn't tell you. And I'm aware, I think we're all aware of situations where people, I think with the best intentions, say, oh, I've been invited to go to a wedding. So maybe if I take a test just before then and it's negative, then I'm good to go. As Dr. Tam and others have mentioned, I've said it myself, is that it depends at the point of time you go for your test. If you're actually, maybe unfortunately were exposed to the virus just a day or so before you go for the test, you might well get a negative test and then have that false assurance thinking, oh, I'm fine, I don't have the virus, I can do what I want. And I think that's not the case. So I think people need to understand the limitations of the test. And even if you were to get a test, I think it would be good, let's say, if you were to go to that wedding, say, okay, at least I tested negative. But at that wedding, I would still recommend that all the wedding guests and so on still practice all of the other good public health measures, the physical distancing and so on and so forth. Thank you.
My follow-up question is about the vaccine, which you spoke about at length before. In the States, Dr. Fauci has said that it's not great that we'll get a highly effective vaccine, a vaccine that would be in the 98% range, which seems to be the gold standard of which, meaning will be totally okay to be going forward. He said he's hoping maybe we could get a 75% effective vaccine, but that they will approve a vaccine that is 50% effective. Is there a number in mind that you will approve a vaccine at? Is it 50% or above? And do you think that we will at any point get to a vaccine that will be in that 98% range?
Well, given that none of that data is actually available, I think it's difficult to actually give any kind of idea. I think this is why I believe there are now 8 phase 3 clinical trials. They will begin to give us an inkling on some of the effectiveness, at least related to those types of vaccines or technologies. So I don't think one can guess an exact level of protection. But even a vaccine that does not protect you completely from getting the virus could also reduce severity or serious illness. So that is another endpoint that the clinical trial approaches will look for as well. So I think that, I haven't heard of a specific number that the regulatory benchmark is aimed against. I think some of the clinical trials will sort of inform us. But, say if it's 50 to 60% effective against an infection, we may want to look at, well, does it also then reduce the severity of illness as well? And so I think those kind of results need to be sort of reviewed in a more holistic way for part of the regulatory approval process.
Thank you, Doctor. Prochaine question, la presse canadienne.
Nadib, la presse canadienne. Dr. New, tout à l'heure, en répondant à Michel de TVA, j'ai cru vous entendre dire que pour le vaccin russe, c'est un peu surprenant. Pouvez-vous expliquer pourquoi? Est-ce que c'est ça que vous avez dit? Et si oui, pourquoi est-ce que ce serait surprenant qu'il soit arrivé un vaccin?
Surprising. Can you tell me
Merci pour
why
la question. Ce que je comprends aussi, regarde, c'est quoi le temps entre les découvertes, le premier essai clinique et l'annonce qu'on a, une approbation pour un vaccin. On sait même maintenant, on a dit pour les essais vraiment de phase 3, ça prend des dizaines et milliers de personnes. Il faut vraiment regarder, analyser les résultats après beaucoup de mois avec beaucoup de personnes vaccinées dans un essai de phase 3. Moi, je n'ai pas des détails qu'est-ce qui se passait en Russie. Et donc, c'est vraiment important, je pense, pas pour moi personnellement, mais pour les experts à travers le monde, de vraiment avoir l'accès aux renseignements, les données probantes, l'évidence, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé en Russie pour peut-être avoir une meilleure idée, c'est quoi le potentiel pour le vaccin annoncé par la Russie.
More about the potential of the vaccine announced by Russia.
It's just surprising in terms of, from what I understand, in terms of when I think the potential vaccine candidate was first, I think, discovered or put forward in Russia, compared to the timelines for the various clinical trials to the point now where I think they've announced at least the approval of the vaccine. It seems quite short based on what we know about how normally vaccine trials go. As we've just said a few minutes ago, in terms of the phase 3 trials, the largest and in many ways the most important, where you're actually vaccinating tens of thousands of people, seeing what happens over months, and then obviously analyzing the results and so on. That takes time, and so I think it is important. I think not for me personally, but I think for the real experts around the world to actually be able to get access to the quote the Russian data, the evidence, the scientific information, to be able to understand exactly what has happened with respect to their trials, and then to be able to draw conclusions and have a better idea of the potential of this Russian vaccine.
Et mon autre question, je sais que vous n'aimez pas critiquer ou passer des commentaires sur les autorités de santé publique dans les provinces, mais hier, le Québec a annoncé des masques dans les écoles, mais pas dans les classes. Alors, j'aimerais quand même entendre l'opinion de la santé publique canadienne. Vous avez eu des directives. Vendredi, vous avez publié le fait que les enfants ou les adolescents soient dans une classe avec 29 autres, il n'y aura pas de bulles, et dans ces classes-là, pas de masques. Ça, vous en pensez quoi?
Moi, je pense que tous les autorités, les experts de santé publique à travers le Canada, on est tous sur la même page. Moi, j'ai beaucoup de contacts. Je discute aussi avec mes homologues au Québec. Et je respecte la décision. Ils ont pris concernant leur ligne directrice avec toutes les couches de protection. Parce que ce n'est pas seulement une question des masques, qu'est-ce qu'on fait dans les écoles concernant les couvre-visage. Il y a plusieurs des couches de protection. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait pour avoir la distanciation physique? Qu'est-ce qu'on fait pour la ventilation dans les écoles? Il y a beaucoup des autres options, même peut-être les barrières physiques, etc. Donc, finalement, maintenant, je pense que ce que je comprends bien, c'est sûr, on utilise le masque d'une certaine façon, peut-être dans des situations comme dans les corridors des écoles, quand c'est difficile de garder une distance de 2 mètres. Oui, c'est important. Et dans la classe, je pense aussi un principe très important, c'est pour le mieux possible, c'est vraiment garder la distance physique, c'est possible, de 2 mètres. Avec les autres options comme la ventilation et le port de masque dans les corridors, je pense que c'est dans l'ensemble, je pense que ce que les autorités de santé publique et aussi d'éducation au Québec ont élaboré, je pense que oui, je pense que les principes sont pareils partout au Canada aussi avec même ce que nous avons aussi dit dans nos lignes directrices.
And I think this is also in line with what we said in our guidelines. Follow-up question. But you were saying that it is impossible to maintain social distancing in schools in many situations if there are 25 students in a classroom,
moi, je suis pas sur le terrain et je pense que c'est vraiment comme ça. C'est le défi, mais c'est aussi qu'est-ce que les enseignants, les autorités, les parents, tout le monde ensemble, je pense qu'il y a une bonne collaboration pour travailler, pour trouver c'est quoi les solutions pratiques vraiment sur le terrain. Parce que c'est, comme on dit plusieurs fois, c'est pas seulement une mesure. Si on garde tous les principes de santé publique, même je n'ai même pas mentionné que un autre aspect très important, c'est aussi le nettoyage environnemental, aussi pour assurer que tous les enseignants et les étudiants ont bon accès au savon et aussi l'eau pour se laver les mains fréquemment. Il y a plusieurs aspects pour avoir le meilleur ensemble de couches de protection.
The schools must come up with the best combination of layers of protection.
We'll now turn over to the phone for one last question. Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, is from Heather Urix-West from Global National. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Thank you for taking my question. Dr. Tam, I just wanted to talk to you about class sizes. Given the experiences of countries like Israel, are you concerned that the majority of provinces have not committed to smaller class sizes, limiting the number of kids in classes?
I think, as everyone appreciates, education is in the sort of provincial, local domain. Our recommendation in terms of public health measures, of course, does recommend physical distancing. So it may depend on the actual context of the school itself in terms of the size of the classroom, etc. So I know that there are other measures also in looking at cohorting or putting particularly younger kids in little groups so that you limit the potential number of contacts engaged if there ever was a case in that situation to limit the spread or the number of contacts. So I know those approaches are part of the guidance that we would like to present for consideration, but they are certainly recommendations, and every school context might actually be quite different. So I think I think it would depend, and it would be a decision that would involve school boards, parents, local public health, etc. So, but I think we maintain that physical distancing is one of the key layers of protection in a school context.
Thank you, Dr. Heather. Follow-up?
No, those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That will be all for today's press conference. C'est ce qui met fin à la conférence de presse pour aujourd'hui.